Hi, I'm Dr. John D. Martini. On this particular video module, I'd like to share with you something on a topic you probably have experienced numerous times in your life called fear, or sometimes called phobia. And I'm going to share with you some insights on that you definitely want to write down. And it's probably going to be shocking to you to hear because it's not something you probably have heard before, some of it. And I'm just preparing you for that because most people think, oh, I want to get rid of my fears and not have fear. And I'm going to come from the perspective that fear is an absolutely essential part of your feedback system in life. And put it into context for you so you can appreciate it. So if you have it, you don't have to beat yourself up about it. You can just use it wisely. So you ready to go? Get your pen and paper out, or get ready to type, because I think that's what I'm going to say. You're probably going to watch a few times. So first, I want to say that I want you to imagine a magnet and hold a magnet in your hand. And you've been told that a magnet has two poles, a positive pole, a negative pole. I want you to imagine there's a positive, negative pole in that magnet. Now, if you cut that magnet in half and you try to get the positive pole and separate from the negative pole, what happens? You end up with a positive, negative, and positive, negative. And you thought, well, I didn't do it fast enough. So you take that half, divide it faster, and you still get positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. No matter how many times you cut the magnet, the magnet is magnetized because the atoms in there have polarities to them, dipole moments, and there's a polarity to it. And no matter how much you cut it, it still has a positive, negative to it. It can't manifest without a positive, negative. So what's interesting is it's futile to try to get a positive separate from the negative. You just get a positive, negative, no matter how many times you break it down into small bites. But it's interesting. You can see that. That's Maxwell's partial differential equations that give rise to that, and the laws of conservation that give rise to the charge parity law that gives that. So we cannot get a one-sided magnet. Now, you're probably thinking, well, what does a magnet have to do with phobia? Well, if we think of the negative side of the magnet as a phobia and the positive side of the magnet as a philia, which is phobia's opposite, all of a sudden you realize you can't get phobia without philia. It's exactly like a magnet. Now, let's elaborate on that. First, let me define what phobia or fear is. It's an assumption that you're about to experience in the future through your senses or imagination, more drawbacks and benefits, more losses and gains, more negatives and positives, more pains and pleasures, more disadvantages and advantages from somebody, yourself, or something. Again, it's an assumption that you're about to experience in the future through your senses or imagination, more drawbacks and benefits, more negatives and positives, more losses and gains, more pains and pleasures, more disadvantages and advantages from yourself, from somebody else, or something. Philia, on the other hand, the other side of the magnet, is an assumption that you're about to experience in the future through your senses or imagination, more positives and negatives, more advantage and disadvantage, more gains and losses, more pleasures and pains, more ups and downs, you might say, from somebody, yourself, or something. They're two complete opposite poles, but they're assumptions in the mind that you're about to have in the future, a negative without a positive or a positive without a negative. Now, in actuality, you can't separate the two. So an event you think is going to be negative always has upsides, and an event you think is positive always has downsides. Now, let's put that into context in your kind of a practical life now. Let's say that you're a single guy or a married guy acting single, and you're out on the streets or the night for the night, out on the town, and you meet this hot chick, hot girl, and you're enamored and you're infatuated and you're, whoa, this is a hot one. And you're really attracted to this girl, or you're a girl and you meet this guy and you're highly attracted to him, and you're a bit infatuated. And now you're conscious of the upsides and unconscious of the downsides, and you have a magnetic impulse to attract to them, and you seek them, and you want to be close to them, and it's a high, and you get a dopamine rush, enkephalon, serotonin, vasopressin. You get all these chemical compounds that make you feel attracted and infatuated and fantasizing, etc. And that's called philia. Philia is an attraction towards something, and you're making an assumption that individual has got more positives and negatives, more advantages and disadvantages in your mind. But what happens if you date them for days, weeks, months, or longer? What happens? You start to discover there's downsides. And they were there the whole time, but you were blinded because you're only conscious of one side and unconscious of the downsides. So whenever you have a subjective bias and you have a fantasy of one side without the other, you have a philia. But you can also meet somebody that you think you resent, that you are conscious of the downsides, unconscious of the upsides. And you can also get to know them over the next few months and then find out they have upsides that you didn't see. And at first you were resentful, but then you discovered, oh my God, there were some upsides, and found out that they're actually pretty cool people after all. You could have terrible events in your life that you could eventually look back and go, wow, I'm thankful that happened. But at first you didn't see it. So you're conscious of the downsides and later, and first unconscious of the upsides and later discover the upsides. Well, why have the wisdom of the ages with the aging process? You can have the wisdom of the ages without it by looking right now for the other side. Every time you're infatuated with somebody and you're blind to the downsides and unconscious of the downsides, your intuition is trying to make you conscious of what you're unconscious of. And every time you're resentful and you're focused on the downsides, you're unconscious is hiding the upsides. And your intuition is trying to wake you up to the upsides. Your intuition is trying to bring the unconscious up to where it's equal to the conscious, so you're fully conscious. So you see the full picture. You get to see the magnet as it is, because you don't get a one-sided magnet. You get a bipolar magnet. Magnets always have two sides. Events in life have both sides. There is no good or bad event until you narrow the mind, divide yourself into conscious and unconscious portions and label it. And then over time, those labels eventually get melted away if you're wise. And then you get to see both sides of the event and you realize the thing is great. It's got downsides. The thing you think is terrible, it's got upsides. I met this lady that bought this house and she was infatuated with this house. She said, oh my God, I finally got my house, my dream house. And she saw all the upsides. And the next year, she found out the market went down. The equity was down below. They actually owed money on it. The interest rate had gone up. They bought it on an arm and they bought it and they had higher interest rate. They had cracks. The builder went out of business. They couldn't get anybody to fix the last portions of the house. They had maintenance. They had to landscape the house. They had to go and maintain the house. They had a mortgage they were paying, interest that was going up. They had to clean it all the time. They had to do landscaping. They had to get furniture for the house. They had to get a new car because the house was nice. They couldn't drive the old car. And they thought, my God, it's just been an absolute a black hole sinking in economics. And they thought they were upsides, and then they later found out the downsides. But why have the wisdom of the ages with the aging process, as I've said? Why not just know there's two sides? When somebody comes up to you and says, oh, you're so nice, you're so kind, your bullshit meter goes off and says, you don't really know me. I have times when I'm also very mean and very, very curt. If you look very carefully, you have both sides. You're sometimes nice, sometimes mean, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel. You have both sides. You're not a nice person. You're not a mean person. You're a human being, and you have the capacity for bringing both out. You can be actually the softest pussycat. You can be the roughest tiger. You have both sides. To really know yourself, you got to understand both sides. To know another individual, you got to know both sides. So if you're having a fantasy, you're blind to the downsides. If you're having a nightmare or a phobia, you're blind to the upsides. But your phobia is actually got benefits. It's letting you know that you're seeing an incomplete awareness and that you've been holding on to a fantasy about what things are supposed to be. Now, what do I mean by that? If you're infatuated with somebody, you'll find out that the moment you're infatuated with them, the more highly infatuated you are, the more you fear their loss. And if you're highly resentful to somebody, the more you resent them, the more you fear their gain. So you actually have fear and phobia emerging by the loss of that which you seek or by the gain of that which you're trying to avoid. On the flip side, you have phileo, the opposite of fear, or fantasy. The moment you get to, you're seeking that which you want, if you get it and you gain what you're looking for, you get philia. And if you lose what you're trying to avoid, you get philia. So the gain of what you're trying to avoid creates phobia. The loss of what you're trying to avoid creates philia. The loss of what it is that you are seeking is phobia. The gain of what you're seeking is philia. You cannot have one without the other. Now, if you're going through life and you're setting goals, and you set a goal that's a true goal, a true objective. Objectivity means even-minded. Both sides of the magnet is in the goal. And the purpose of the executive center in the forebrain is to mitigate the risk associated with the goals that you're setting, to think of all the downsides, to balance all the upsides. So it's not a fantasy, it's a real objective. The purpose of the executive center is to make sure you're not pursuing fantasies of one side, but setting objectives and prepared for both sides to mitigate the risk. Because if you set a fantasy, your brain with its intuition has to bring out phobia and doubt and uncertainty to make sure you think out of all the downsides that it's going to take and all the challenge you're going to take to get the objective. Your phobia is not your enemy. Your phobia is letting you know that you're pursuing philias and not true objectives. And once you set true objectives and you mitigate the risk and you think out both sides and you're prepared for both sides, you have a real objective. You can't build the great Pyramid of Giza, the great China Wall, the great buildings in the world without having pains and pleasures. Anaxagoras said pain and pleasure are inseparable from each other. C.S. Lewis the same way, Plato the same thing. You can't get those two separated. But the mind, out of its ignorance and its unconscious judgments, tend to separate the inseparables, divide the indivisibles, label the unlabellables, name the ineffable, and polarize the unpolarizables, and make us not see both sides. And the individual that doesn't see both sides is living in a delusion about what's about to happen. If you're infatuated, you're deluded because you're ignorant of the downsides. If you're resentful, you're ignorant of the upsides. When you're wise, you see both sides, and you're prepared, and you embrace both sides. You want to be loved for both sides. People want to be loved for both sides. When you can finally have an objective and understand when you're marrying somebody, they're going to have two sides, and you expect both sides, you have realistic expectations. But if you have a fantasy that's supposed to be always kind, never cruel, always nice, never mean, always positive, never negative, you have a fantasy. You don't have a real goal, you have a fantasy. And you don't have a real relationship, you have a delusion. But if you embrace both sides of them, both sides of your goals, you have a true objective, and you can actually meet those. Those are livable. They're achievable. And many people set up fantasies that are unachievable, then live with anxieties and fears and self-depreciation that surfaces in their unconscious intuitively to let them know as a feedback that they're setting a fantasy And therefore, that's getting them actually on track to set real goals by being objective. So many people think, oh, I got to get rid of my fear and avoid it and keep going after my fantasy. What's wrong with me? I'm weak. I'm living in fear. No, your fear is your friend. It's making sure you don't go after fantasies and making sure that you go after true objectives in life. When you're living congruently in your highest values, you embrace both pain and pleasure, support and challenge, ease and difficulty, positive and negatives equally in the pursuit of a goal, a real objective. If you're living in your lower values, you tend to want to avoid a predator and seek prey, avoid pain, seek pleasure, and you tend to shoot for fantasies. Impulsive, compulsive, immediate gratifying, addictive behaviors are compensations for unfulfilled highest values. It's in your highest values, when you set goals that are aligned with those, you set the most true objectives and you achieve the most. But if you're trying to live by the injected values of others and setting up fantasies about how you want to be with grandeur, setting too big of goals without a structure, without a strategic plan, that automatically in your brain, you're going to have anxieties and fears and self-depreciation surface in the brain as a normal biological behavior to try to get you to strategize that, to get yourself grounded and make sure you have a real objective. Many people have been trying to get rid of half of themselves instead of understanding that that half of themselves is an essential self, a part of them to make sure they're setting real objectives. So there's no philia without a phobia. There's no fantasy without a nightmare. There's no one side without the other, like a magnet. And if you want magnetism to attract into your life what you really want, set real goals. Imagine if I gave you a coin that had a heads and a tails, and the amount of coins that you accumulated was your self-worth. And you said, well, I only want the heads, I don't want the tails. And I'm going to get rid of the tails, I just want to get the heads. How many coins would you accumulate? You'd never accumulate any self-worth because you keep striving for a one-sided coin and not embracing the two sides of the coin. So a real objective embraces both sides. Again, objectivity means even-minded, a balanced mind. Subjectivity means partial-minded, bias-minded, and it's usually fantasies. Animals are avoiding pain and seeking pleasure and wanting one side. And the Buddhist teaching, the Buddha says the desire for that which is unavailable, the positive pole, and the desire to avoid that which is unavoidable, the negative pole, is a source of human suffering. And we keep suffering our life unnecessarily because we keep striving for fantasies and then keep having phobias. Philias and phobias are inseparable. When you put them together, you actually get an experience called love. Love is a balance of those two. The things you like about the person and the things you dislike about the person, when you can love both of those, you get to love the person. You get to do what you love with objectives and goals in life when you embrace both sides. So I just want to take the moment in this brief video to talk about phobias, because these phobias are something that every human being faces, and they're not a bad thing. They're a feedback to guide us to set real goals in real time with real strategies and prepare for both sides. You have 7 areas of life you can have these phobias in. You can have the fear of not being smart enough, not being degreed enough, not being educated enough, because you're comparing yourself to somebody that's got a different set of values than you, and you're not honoring where you have your genius. You could be comparing yourself to people in business and thinking that you're not successful. You could be comparing yourself to people with wealth and they think you're not as wealthy as they are, or you're not as stable in your relationship, or you're not with a more beautiful spouse, or you're maybe not as savvy socially and have as big a network. Your Facebook doesn't have as many people, or you're physically you think you're not as attractive or strong or healthy as somebody else, or you're not as inspired or spiritually aware as somebody else. The moment you minimize yourself to others and exaggerate them and minimize you and put them on a pedestal and inject their values in your life and go away from your own highest values, the unfulfillment that will occur and the self-depreciation will put you in your amygdala where you want to avoid pain and seek pleasure and set fantasies and create fears. And your fears are a reminder to set real goals with real strategies that are real objectives, and to not put people on pedestals or pits, but put them in your heart. When you have equity between yourself and others and you live by your highest values, you have more resilience, adaptability, less distress, more function as a master, and you end up not living with extreme phobias. There are 2 types of stress: the perception of loss of that which you seek and the perception of gain of that which you're trying to avoid. When you actually have a balanced orientation, those distresses dissolve, and you're now ready for a real goal and a real achievement. And the person that does that embraces both sides of their life, both sides of the goal, both sides of the people involved in the goal, and they have real objectives that get really met. So just know that your phobia is not necessarily your enemy. Your phobia could be your friend if it's thought through wisely, and understood that as long as we're addicted to fantasies, we're going to create nightmares out of our life. Give yourself permission to go after real objectives and allow the phobias and philias to be feedbacks to guide us back into real achievement in our life.
So I hope you guys like that video. Pretty much make sure you guys subscribe, like the video, and we're going to keep sending out a lot of these beautiful gems and pearls, and make sure you stay tuned. Till next time, I will see you guys. Peace out, YouTube.